Okay, folks, perhaps we might make a start. A very warm welcome along to this, the first in our Menzies Centre seminar series for 2015. There is a piece of paper that's going round. It might possibly need to go back that way, Carl, if that's all right. If you could just pop your name on it to let us know who you are and that you're here, that would be very much appreciated. This evening we have a panel which I'm delighted to present on the theme of journals and periodicals. And we'll take the speakers in the order that they were advertised. So Ken will be speaking first, followed by Mary. And I think it might work best if we have both papers back to back and then pull the questions at the end, if that's okay with you. So let me make some more formal introductions. Ken Gelder is Professor of English and Co-Director of the Australian Centre at the University of Melbourne. He's very well published, with books including the co-authored Uncanny Australia, Sacredness and Identity in a Post-Colonial Nation, Popular Fiction, The Logistics and Practices of a Literary Field, the co-authored After the Celebration, Australian Fiction, 1989 to 2007, and, very catchy title this one, New Vampire Cinema. So that came out, I think, last year?
Year before.
Year before, okay. And most recently, he's co-editor with Rachel Weaver of the Colonial Journals and the Emergence of Australian Literary Culture. This paper was co-written with Rachel, who is a research fellow in English at the University of Melbourne. After Ken, we'll be hearing from Dr Mary Shannon, who completed her PhD here at King's. She's now a postdoctoral research fellow in the English and Creative Writing Department at the University of Roehampton in London. Her book, Dickens, Reynolds and Mayhew on Wellington Street, The Print Culture of a Victorian Street, is forthcoming with Ashgate and will be launched by us here at the Menzies Centre on the 20th of May 2015. So, without further ado, over to Ken for the first paper.
Thank you. Should I stand up?
It's entirely up to you. It might be easier to turn the slides from up there.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for having me here, everyone. I'm a Mac user, so I don't know how to do this really, but there must be a keyboard here somewhere. Maybe not. There's a little pen. Can I prod something with a pen?
Let's just have a look. It's just under here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And just get your PowerPoint up. It's that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
okay.
That, and then just to slip him out a bit. Just that one too.
Thank you.
So this is somewhere we can do some of the lights.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
true.
That's the one.
That's true.
Oh, yeah. Maybe a bit more.
Yeah, the camera as well.
Oh, okay. So we need a bit of light for the camera.
Yeah.
So, how's that? Yeah, that's the one.
That's it.
Oh, that looks very good. Thank you very much. So, yeah, okay. Like a rabbit in the spotlight. So this paper is called Literary Journals and Literary Aesthetics in Early Post-Federation Australia. And so it has been co-written with Rachel Weaver, who I work with at the University of Melbourne, and it's really half of a longer paper about post-Federation journals. The first decade after the Federation of Australia, the first decade of the 20th century, saw the establishment of a significant number of new Australian literary journals and magazines. Steele Rudd's magazine began in 1904, lasting for 3 years and then resurrecting itself several times over until the end of the 1920s. C.J. Dennis's South Australian journal, The Gadfly, also lasted for 3 years from February 1906 to February 1909. Journals like these were, in one sense, offshoots of the Bulletin, creating alternative literary spaces not only for Bulletin contributors themselves, but also for a new generation of aspiring writers and editors who had come to regard the Bulletin as limited in its range. Even A.G. Stevens, the editor of the Bulletin's Red Page, had set up a different journal, The Bookfellow, to provide what Ostlit, you know, the Ostlit online site, calls a sophisticated alternative to the Bulletin. Stuart Lee in the ADB calls it a small dilettantish magazine. The bookfellow ran for a few months in 1899, and then when Stevens actually left the Bulletin, it started again in 1907 and lasted into the 1920s. Norman Lindsay went on to celebrate a number of Bulletin personalities in his book, Bohemians of the Bulletin, but he too sought out alternative publishing venues, setting up the short-lived Rambler magazine in early 1899, for example. The most significant literary journal of the decade, of that first decade of the 20th century, was J.F. Archibald and Frank Fox's Sydney-based Lone Hand, which began publication in May 1907 and claimed high levels of circulation, around 50,000 for the first few issues. Lone Hand had some beautiful covers and really celebrated femininity too, but anyway, that's another paper. Writing about the Bulletin, writing about the Bulletin poet Hugh McCrae, Norman Lindsay remarked, "The Lone Hand came at the right time for both Hugh and myself. It gave us a chance to have our works produced in a decent format, and that has a great deal to do with inspiring works." The view that alternative literary spaces were needed, even for Bulletin contributors themselves, had been around since at least the end of the 1890s, with the demise of influential journals like Cosmos from 1899 and Southern Cross, which ended in November 1900. The Australian magazine, which you can see up there, lasted only a few months. You see that wonderful cover of a naked horseman riding through an outcrop of flowers. What are they? Those flowers? Waratahs. Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like it's a sketch written, sketched against the kind of Bulletin sketches of drovers on horseback. This is a naked man on a rearing black horse. You don't often see naked drovers. Anyway, the Australian magazine lasted only a few months, from March to September 1899. One of its editors was Arthur Jose. In the Romantic 90s, published in 1933, Jose recalled a motley collection of artists and authors like George Lambert, Roderick Quinn and Christopher Brennan, who were instrumental in getting this journal underway. In those days, he wrote, the Bulletin was the only vehicle for their wares, and it didn't welcome what they believed to be the best of their stuff. The short, intense life of the Australian magazine is in sharp contrast with the sheer longevity of the Bulletin, one of the many casualties of a boom and bust literary economy. Jose wrote, it died in September amid the hilarious laughter of its parents. So at the moment of federation and following in its wake, just when the nation brings its colonies together, there is a splintering of literary activity across a number of journals that fragments, or perhaps continues to fragment, any received sense of what constitutes a national literature. The literary magazine in this instance claims a relative autonomy for itself, distanced from larger nationally representative projects. An obvious example of which is the Bulletin's slogan, Australia for the Australians, which became Australia for the White Man under James Edmonds' post-Federation editorship in 1903. Smaller literary magazines can also distance themselves from mainstream literary discourses, a point that's often made about the early modernist magazines circulating in Britain and the United States around the same time. As Eric White notes, the predominant feature of the little magazines in the rise of literary modernism was their ability to catalyse and sustain the production of avant-garde artworks and specialised discourse networks. In Melbourne, in the first decade after Federation, a further suite of new little magazines appeared that seemed to encapsulate exactly these formations, creating alternative aesthetic spaces for Bulletin contributors and a number of other writers, many of whom, like the journals themselves, have long since faded into obscurity. The distributor and publisher Thomas C. Lothian had his premises in Elizabeth Street and Little Collins Street in Melbourne. Lothian was already networked into local literary and academic circles and was a member of the Australian Literature Society, founded in 1899. But as a publisher, he came to encourage a raft of emergent, socially and aesthetically progressive writers who helped to reconfigure the received literary canon. In 1906, he published his first original Australian book, the radical Irish socialist and bulletin contributor Bernard O'Dowd's The Silent Land and Other Verses. Following this, with O'Dowd's Dominions of the Boundary in 1907, John Le Gay Brereton, Sea and Sky in 1908, and Emily Robb's Jetsam in 1908, among other collections of new Australian poetry, which is something he really invested heavily in. During this time, Lothian also published 3 important literary journals, each of which took local literary writing in new directions. The Native Companion, which lasted from January to December 1907, Trident, which lasted from May 1907 to April 1909, and Heart of the Rose, which lasted from December 1907 to October 1908. And these are the journals I want to look at here today. Lothian's Melbourne journals were not especially antagonistic to the Sydney Bulletin, not least because they did share some of the same contributors, but they were certainly clear about the distinctive aesthetic space they wanted to inhabit. The first issue of the Native Companion in January 1907 opens with an essay by its editor Bertram Stevens titled Genius and Australia. It's a really good essay to open a new journal with. Anyway, so he says, alongside of the Bush School is an independent group whose work shows hardly any local influences at all. The writings of Victor Daly, Roderick Quinn, George Essex Evans, J.B. O'Hara, Christopher Brennan, John Le Gay Brereton, Sidney Jeffcott, James Hebblethwaite and others form just as important and quite as large a part of recent Australian verse as the purely bush literature. They've not been led away by common obvious themes, and nor have they strained after local colour, he writes. In fact, this minor canon of late colonial male poets, although it's important to the Native Companion's aesthetic reaction against local colour, was already circulating through the Bulletin anyway. This is where many of these writers published their earliest works. But when E.J. Brady, I don't know whether people know that guy, took over as editor with Volume 2 in August 1907, a very different canon began to emerge, and the magazine itself was significantly transformed. Carol Mills makes this point in her 1999 introduction to the journal when she notes, I'm quoting her, Volume 1 of the Native Companion looked like a late 19th century literary periodical, but Volume 2 from August 1907, so I have Volume 1 there and Volume 2 there, was a child of the 20th century, when it shifts from D.H. Souter's linear cover design with its isolated figures, the man reading alone in the corner up there by candlelight and the solitary bird in the forest, to Ruby Lindsay, Norman Lindsay's sister, more fluid, feminine, silhouetted flock. And I'll get to another cover later on, Blamire Young's flowing, sort of flowing scene of these birds, which I'll come to later on, which shows, actually I might even quickly scroll down to it now. Yeah, this one here, which shows its native companions nourished by this, sort of feminine figure, I guess, from classical myth. Carol Mills regards E.J. Brady, the new editor, as clamorously nationalistic, she says, but she also situates the journal in the framework of its bohemian social networks, with its contributors meeting at Fazli's restaurant in King Street in Melbourne every month. And she characterises its alternative literary position in typically mainstream terms. So she writes at times, Volume 2 was self-conscious of its separation from the popular herd, and it could be rather precious, she says. E.J. Brady encouraged the publication of short lyric poetry from Christopher Brennan and Brereton and Roderick Quinn that contrasted with the more robust masculine poetry of the Bulletin's nationalist tradition. And he also drew together a group of newer women writers whose work gave the Native Companion a feminine aesthetic more attuned to emergent forms of literary modernism, consistent with those later cover designs by Ruby Lindsay and Blamire Young. the vignette becomes an important form here. Stories by Mabel Forrest, Summer Locke, Beatrix Tracy, B. Cecil Doyle, and also Sidney Partridge provide brief glimpses into a usually female protagonist's consciousness, rendering intensely felt emotions and embedding themselves in the particularity of their setting, which may or may not be Australian. It's now generally well known that Catherine Mansfield published her earliest works in the Native Companion, 3 stories under her own name and 1 signed as Julian Mark, 4 very short stories in total, including a story titled Vignettes, set in London, another story titled Silhouettes, set in New Zealand, in which a young woman gazes out of her window, seized by a passionate desire, the story says, for everything that is hidden and forbidden. Mansfield's stories help to open up the connections between colonial identity and literary modernism in the Native Companion. And indeed, this journal, we want to argue, Rachel Weaver and I want to argue, enabled a local modernist aesthetic to develop a couple of decades before the usual points of origin ascribed to Australian modernism by literary commentators. Most commentators really identify literary modernism beginning in Australia in the late 1920s. So I think it begins earlier here. The New Zealand critic Mark Williams has read Mansfield's Native Companion stories as precursors to literary modernism, as if they speak to literary debates a decade earlier, that is, the 1890s, but a different kind of 1890s. So he writes, the vignettes, and he's talking really only about Mansfield's stories in this magazine, the vignettes were decidedly fin de siècle in style and tone. For Mansfield at this time meant Oscar Wilde and the decadence, not the cultural nationalism and anti-imperial sentiment of the 1890s in Australia. However, Mary Ann Giles has given Mansfield's Native Companion stories a more emergent role, affiliated to trends in European modernism. And of course, 2 years later, Mansfield would publish much longer discursive stories in Alfred Arage's influential literary magazine, The New Age. Giles also sees these early Native Companion stories of Mansfield's as stretching modernism's reach back into the antipodes. So she writes, the vignette or slice of life story format is one of the most important means used by Mansfield to represent the female perspective. In the process of depicting these intense moments, Mansfield not only creates new spaces to represent women's experience, she also makes use of her New Zealand life, translating it in ways that extend modernism beyond its Anglo-European boundaries. We want to suggest that the vignettes published in the Native Companion, not just by Mansfield, but also by Mabel Forrest, Beatrix Tracy, Sidney Partridge and others, really interesting writers, sits somewhere in between the influences of fin de siècle decadence and newly emergent European modernisms. They evoke a nascent aesthetic modernism that turns away from the bush, allowing us to contrast the vignette as primarily a feminine metropolitan form with the masculine provinciality of the sketch, so ubiquitous to a range of Australian literary magazines at this time, like The Lone Hand and, of course, like The Bulletin. Having said that, we must also note that writers such as Mabel Forrest and Sidney Partridge, and even Mansfield herself, also contributed to those other magazines. Mansfield published a short poem in The Lone Hand in October 1909. It's not as if the Native Companion was alone in its commitment to a nascent modernist aesthetic, in other words. And Australian writers were versatile here, adapting their literary forms to suit the temperaments of different journals. The situation in Australia, in fact, resembles Elisa Grilly and Evangelia Stead's account of French little magazines during this period. La Plume, for example, which ran from 1899 to 1906. There was, they note, much migration across magazines. Relationships established within and between magazines becomes a marked feature of periodical culture and the general artistic field in the 1890s and 1900s. Thomas Lothian's investment in specialised literary journals in Australia was certainly risky, and none of them lasted for more than 2 years. Trident, you can see there on the left, at first seemed to be unusually secure anchored to the English, French and German departments at the University of Melbourne under Walter Murdoch's editorship, and with an interest in humanities education in particular, in pedagogy. But in the May 1908 issue, Murdoch recognised the danger of tying a journal to high-minded literary and pedagogical ideals, and he sought to open Trident up to a broader range of literary interests. So he wrote, "To begin with, it will be noticed that we are no longer trilingual or even bilingual. That experiment we've definitely put behind us. We've decided," he wrote, "that the Trident is not to be any longer a magazine for specialists." He wanted to take the Trident, as he put it, in the direction of a general Australian review. But in fact, the focus on French, German and English literature remained, and was reaffirmed when another lecturer in English at the University of Melbourne, Archibald Strong, took over as the editor. The desire to engage more widely with local public affairs was hampered by its close connection to university life, and its European focus prevented it from developing a distinctive Australian identity, even though its contributors included Vance Palmer, Hugh McRae and John Le Gay Brereton and Bernard O'Dowd. Bernard O'Dowd wrote an essay on art and sanity discussing Max Nordau and Bernard Shaw for the magazine, and he contributed a poem called Australia Mavoureen that plays out a genealogy of European mythical traditions and then turns towards a very romantically conceived Anglo-Irish Australian future. The editorial in the final issue of Trident in April 1909 is a pragmatic, almost cheerful response to the journal's inevitable collapse, perhaps under its own linguistic weight. After the month, the editor writes, "The Trident will cease to appear. It's sorry for its subscribers, against whom its only complaint is that they are so few in number. It's sorrier still for the great majority who might have been expected to read and buy it but have never done so. To the one class it extends its thanks, to the other its compassionate forgiveness. It bears practically no malice, and it dies well pleased on the whole with everybody, including itself." A third Lothian little magazine that I want to talk about just for a few minutes, The Heart of the Rose, is also short-lived. It's just 4 issues, each of them published as a limited edition of 500 copies. But it embraces specialisation by producing a kind of radical aesthetic autonomy that depends on the formation of a new, or we might say intensively renewed, national literary canon. For Stuart Sayers, who's written a very good book on Lothian, the publisher Thomas Lothian, The Heart of the Rose was, he says, a remarkable publication, lavishly produced but too precious to survive. That word, precious, which Carol Mills had used to describe the native companion, does suggest something at once sort of rarefied and narcissistic and ill-suited to the pragmatics of literary production. Heart of the Rose was edited by William Mitchell. Stuart Sayers calls him a minor poet and aesthete. And it was intensely influenced by French symbolist poetry and by the role of the poet as prophet, with one issue introduced by an extract from William Blake's Milton. The first issue concluded with Nettie Palmer's translation into prose of Paul Verlaine's Ars Poetica from 1882. The fourth issue translated a poem by Rimbaud, and Archibald Strong from the University of Melbourne contributed essays on Swinburne and Baudelaire, playing down the decadence of the latter and talking up his symbolist aspects instead. Helen Hewson has recently described John Sean Nielsen's encounter with Nettie Palmer's translation of Verlaine in this journal. She also notes that French symbolist poetry circulated through other Australian journals, including the Bulletin and Stevens' Bookfellow, A.G. Stevens' Bookfellow. But The Heart of the Rose internalises these influences. It strips them of their playfulness and their mockery, and then uses all this as a way of fabricating a revived national literature that is able to speak to an international literary scene. Bernard O'Dowd's long prose piece in the first issue is called Morgana Mine and Other Realities, and it's a manifesto for the journal's poetic vision of Australia itself, drawing directly on Verlaine's image of the poet as a spirit of the air in Ars Poetica. It describes a meeting between the author and an unnamed woman in the centre of Australia, perched on top of Chambers Pillar and looking out across the sky. O'Dowd offers a delirious panoramic vision of a country that is literally possessed by its poets, whose spirits seem to flow through the places that they inhabit. And as it does so, it creates a unique literary canon that the journal then absorbs into itself, allowing the Heart of the Rose to produce a kind of indexical relationship to the landscape and to a national literature. So I put this long quote up on the PowerPoint here. This is an amazing quotation, I think. Here surely is the Olympus of the Australian dispensation, where the gods we make by our virtues and our powers shall abide and cherish us forever. I put the full names of the poets in square brackets. Frank Myers and his friends prefer Riverina. Sidney Jeffcott and his Need, the ripple and roar of the Kosciuszko waters. Frank Williamson, one of the petals of our own rose, we hope, and one who will be found very near the heart itself, clings with his blue-eyed friend to the opalescence over Matlock River. Roderick Quinn and Victor Daly and Chris Brennan float faithfully as an efflorescence of its subtler glory over the blue and gold and sunshine of Sydney. Adam Lindsay Gordon, almost as a volcano cloud, hovers over Gambia. Kendall, Henry Kendall, wafts to grave James Hebblethwaite at Georgetown his preference of Araluen, which is the name of Henry Kendall's daughter, who had died in infancy, and was the subject of a poem that Kendall wrote in 1879, but it's also a place name. It's the name of a river in New South Wales. Even over the Tears, and Tears River and Lake Tears are in southern Victoria, of course, and the Derwent and Wellington, while Jessie Mackay, Queen of the Southern Alps, signals us all that her vara dare not be ignored. She's a New Zealand poet who in fact was published by Thomas Lothian. And this last reference is to Kipling's poem Evara and His Gods, which is about a character who makes idolatrous images. So poetry is given this role, broadly speaking, in the Heart of the Rose. It's tied to creation myths and to the poet as a godlike or transcendental figure. The nationalism of the journal is therefore both exact, because poets are tied to local, particular zones or places, and amorphous. It's simultaneously exact and amorphous, already shaped by French symbolist imagery, and then made to radiate outwards as a kind of free-floating global and trans-historical effect. Part of this effect involves imagining Australia as a kind of Arcadia that was already lodged deep inside the European imagination. Something that Ian McLean argues in his book White Aborigines, Identity Politics in Australian Art, something that he argues was the outcome of a denial of actual colonial conditions. So he writes, Australian subjectivity is founded on an age-old Western figures of otherness. It's founded on age-old Western figures of otherness. The most significant being the notions of the Antipodes and an austral utopia. This gives Australians a perverse claim to being European. Indeed, a common strategy of Australians who fear their perverse origins is to read the metaphors of an Antipodes and a southern utopia back into classical texts. The playwright Louis Esson was a contributor to the Heart of the Rose. He'd recently returned from Europe, spending some time in Paris and meeting W.B. Yeats in Dublin. Later on, in 1921, Esson wrote, "I've always looked on Mr. Yeats as the high priest of literature." In a long piece for the Heart of the Rose called Terra Australis, Fragments of a Conversation, Esson introduces three characters, the stranger, the mystic, and a host, in a setting that recalls the stock location of those familiar bush nationalist sketches you might find in the bulletin. The setting is titled The Hut, Lazy Creek. The stranger in this narrative is a newcomer who thinks that Australia has no local culture and no history, but the host insists that Australia is a kind of attitude, a vernacular condition that all great writers around the world instinctively share, including Verlaine. In fact, he says Michelangelo, Wordsworth, Blake and Paul Verlaine, Whistler and Norman Lindsay, they are all very patriotic Australians. The mystic agrees with this, unleashing Australia into exactly the sort of global trans-historical literary archive that Ian McLean has described in his book. So I've got another long quote here, which is from Louis Esson's narrative. where the mystic says, Australia is not restricted by geographical boundaries. She's everywhere, in America, India, Italy, ancient Persia, in modern Ireland too. Greek philosophers dreamed of her, meditating in the Academe, in painted Stoa, in the garden of Epicurus, and Indian teachers under the bow tree, and prophets who dimly taught in old Crotona. William Morris, who was a seer, founded Terra Australis in Chaucer's England. Spanish captains like Balboa and Ponce de Leon and de Quiros sought her overseas, and the world today still strives to pluck out the heart of her mystery. Terra Australis beckons at the slip rails of the imagination. It becomes a really important little phrase in Australian literary culture, the slip rails of the imagination, promising but to the rebels a fresh perception of beauty, an unblazed track to truth. The influence of French symbolism on Australian poetry usually finds its origins in Christopher Brennan, who wrote for the Heart of the Rose and a range of other journals, including the Australian Magazine, the Bookfellow and the Bulletin. Brennan gives a series of lectures in Sydney on French symbolism in July 1904, and of course it corresponded famously with Stéphane Mallarmé, whose work he venerated. Recent books by David Brooks, John Hawke and Catherine Barnes have all identified symbolism's influence in Australia with Brennan, emphasising in particular that link to Mallarmé. For Paul Kane, in his book on Australian poetry, this makes Brennan unique, but it also makes him a liability for the local poetry scene. So Paul Kane writes, I think I've got that quote on PowerPoint, oh no, perhaps not, sorry. So Paul Kane writes, in the global economy of influence, Brennan is a free trade advocate willing to finance an imbalance of payments where one imports more than one exports. Brennan has no desire to protect fledgling industries at home, young poets, he puts in brackets, from the multitudinal dumping of foreign giants of mass production, and then in brackets he puts European romantics and symbolists. So Brennan was a poet who who imported much more than he exported, in other words. So putting aside Kane's conflation of symbolism, romanticism and mass production and mass importation, I guess we might say, this remark effectively isolates Brennan from a local poetic economy that he actively participated in. As one contributor among many others to the Heart of the Rose, for example, which drew on Verlaine, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, but actually, interestingly, not Stéphane Mallarmé. The Heart of the Rose was another free trade advocate, we might say then, but it also wanted to use the influence of French symbolist poetry as the means of reshaping and redefining an Australian literary canon, at least at the level of rhetoric. It was an Australian literary magazine, little magazine, that allowed itself to imagine that it was powerful enough to radiate its own influences back to Europe. The Heart of the Rose's investment in Australian literature as a globalised trans-historical object of reverence and desire also meant downplaying decadent literary influences, as we noted with Archibald Strong's essay on Baudelaire, which really talks up his symbolism, not his decadence. The move towards federation brought with it a rejection of the despondency and melancholy of the bush nationalist tradition and encouraged a sense that Australian literature, in order to have universal appeal, should be positive, active and outward-looking. This journal, Heart of the Rose, gives us an early manifestation of a newer vitalist tradition in Australian literature. But this meant that even though its contributors were influenced by, for example, French symbolist poets like Paul Verlaine, they were obliged to distance themselves from a Europe that was now seen to be derivative and in decline. Louis Esson's mystic says, "The old worlds lose touch of reality. Their pulse grows feeble. They repeat only the thoughts of their ancestors living at second hand. Australia feels the life-giving sun in her blood." The investment in vitalism after Federation has been well documented, reaching its apotheosis in Tom Inglis' Moore's book Social Patterns in Australian Literature from 1971. Inglis Moore had talked about the earth vigour of Australian writing, as he puts it, in strongly masculine terms, even recuperating Henry Lawson into this tradition by pushing aside Lawson's melancholic reputation to speak instead about his characteristic vigour and so on. For Inglismore, I'm quoting him, there has been no period of decadence in Australia. Australia may still be an empty land, but so far it has not become a wasteland. The national vigour runs too strongly for worlds that go out with a whimper, he says. But the heart of the rose has a residual investment in decadent tropes, like the occulted bush, for example, and in religious mysticism and Orientalism. Some of its contributions populate the bush with Euro-mythological creatures, like a very forgotten writer these days, R.B. Arden's story, The Undine of the Creek, which presents a doomed erotic encounter, really interesting story this one, a doomed erotic encounter between a white water nymph lifted from European legend and an Aboriginal man, merging Western mythology with a kind of appropriated concept of Alcharinga. Occulted dying race narratives like this sit alongside the vitalist repopulation of the bush as a kind of hybridized space, the home of what Inglismore calls the austral pan, for example, a place inhabited by satyrs, sprites, and anthropomorphized animals. These are narratives that are simultaneously fin de siècle and post-Federation, harking back to, for example, the work of the early modernist Australian artist Sidney Long, whose 1898 painting Pan, which is on the, which I haven't reproduced here, I'm sorry, whose 1898 painting Pan was, as one critic writes, aligned with the spirit of Stéphane Mallarmé's Faun, the symbolist poetic embodiment of bucolic liberty and erotic frisson that saw Pan and his pagan flock recur as fin de siècle emblems. Sidney Long's earlier painting, The Spirit of the Plains, which is here, may also have influenced the later cover designs by Ruby Lindsay, which I'd showed before on The Native Companion, and especially this Blamire Young cover of The Native Companion, coming 10 years after that painting by Sidney Long, all of which show us how fin de siècle tropes continued to circulate through the early post-Federation literary scene. And that's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken. Let me just assist with the slides for a moment. Now, our next subject is one that's very dear to my own heart, the Melbourne Punch. So we'll just get that up and running. And the title is on the screen, Melbourne Punch, Literary Networks and the Print Culture of London and Melbourne. To Mary.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to take us further back in time from Ken's paper, and talk about a very masculine experience of print culture and also of immigration. A stone's throw away from where we're all sitting this evening is a small street called Wellington Street, which I mentioned to a couple of you already over drinks. A useful cut-through from Covent Garden to Waterloo Bridge. To all appearances, there is little to connect Wellington Street with the much larger and grander Collins Street in Melbourne. But this paper will reveal some surprising connections between 19th century Wellington Street here in London and Collins Street in Melbourne. And I'm going to do that through the figure of writer and journalist R.H. Horne and the periodical Melbourne Punch. R.H. Horne, Charles Dickens's friend and colleague, worked at Dickens's Household Words office in Wellington Street. He socialised with staff members of London's Punch magazine, who also worked nearby, and exemplified the interconnected networks which operated in and around the street, and helped to build Victorian London's formidable print culture. But in 1852, Horne left Wellington Street and sailed for the Melbourne goldfields. 3 years later, he became a contributor to Melbourne Punch, which was started in 1855 in Collins Street and was presented as a child of London Punch. So this paper will argue that the cultural capital of London's print culture travelled with the bodies of its emigrants and was used to establish the print culture of Melbourne and of Collins Street. The first number of Melbourne Punch depicted writing and publishing as a very personal business, with a cartoon of the anthropomorphised Punch family bidding farewell to Melbourne Punch Jr. as he leaves for Australia. In the cartoon, print culture itself becomes like a family, whose members may emigrate overseas, but who remain connected in an imagined community. The embodied periodical could emigrate just as the London writers and booksellers emigrated. Horne's own body, not just Punch's body, has cultural significance. Horne's personal connections to men like Dickens and Douglas Jerrold, who also operated on Wellington Street, made him the focus of literary gatherings which inspired the next generation of Melbourne writers. As we know, in the space of 2 decades, Melbourne went from a small settlement to a lively literary hub. Of course, much of this growth was driven by the presence of goldfields. However, I want to show ways in which the transplanting of Wellington Street brands like Punch and of celebrities like Horne played a significant role in this dramatic transformation. So I'm going to start with a bit of context about Wellington Street. And where exactly was R.H. Horne's Wellington Street? What was it like when he arrived at the Household Words office, Dickens's magazine, on his first day? Well, in 1850, as now, Wellington Street was just off the Strand. So you can see on the map, Wellington Street comes up from Waterloo Bridge in the middle of the map. And as now, it was surrounded by the theatres, big newspaper offices, particularly at that time, and the Inns of Court. So Wellington Street was full of newspaper and magazine offices, and the many writers and editors of Wellington Street would have encountered playbills, law stationers, university students here at King's, lawyers and printers. In other words, printed matter was everywhere. I got interested in Wellington Street when I was a grad student here at King's, largely because of the presence of Dickens in his office. But it turns out that there were lots of journalists and writers on Wellington Street, as I said. In 1850, when Horne arrived there, Wellington Street was made up of 3 sections. Upper Wellington Street at the top by Covent Garden, Wellington Street North, which ran down to the Strand, where the Lyceum Theatre is today, and finally on the south side of the Strand, the original Wellington Street, known as Wellington Street South, which goes down to Waterloo Bridge. You might have walked across it sometimes from the station. The 18th century brick terraces are still there on parts of Wellington Street, and you can see that their windows are very close together, the houses are very close together, even buildings on the opposite side of the street are really close, so it would have been, people would have been very aware of their neighbours. There would have been the real sense that you would have known who was coming in and out of doors, who was across the street from you, who was working at a lighted window across from you. Many of Horne's neighbours on Wellington Street were part of a network of friends, colleagues and collaborators who visited each other's houses, helped each other professionally and personally, and were even godparents to each other's children. These networks formed, fragmented and reformed over the 1840s and 50s and were connected to 2 key locations. The Punch office, which was at 13 Wellington Street South until January 1844, and the Office of Household Words, which was at 16 Wellington Street North in 1850. The original team of Punch included Mark Lemon and Henry Mayhew as co-editors, amongst others, with Douglas Jerrold as a contributor, John Leach as one of the illustrators. Other early members of the Punch team were W.H. Wills and Albert Smith. By 1850, in this little building here, a few doors down, which housed Household Words, we find Dickens. W.H. Wills, again, he's moved on from Punch. He's now assistant editor of Household Words. We find R.H. Horne and Dickens's father. They shared an office. Next door but one, at number 14, was the office of the Athenaeum. This highly respected literary journal was published by John Francis. John Francis and his boss, Charles Dilke, helped to prop up the Daily News after Dickens had abandoned his ill-advised job as its editor. Until 1849, number 14 had also contained the offices of the Railway Chronicle. This was edited by John Scott Russell, another friend of Dickens, who'd been railway editor for Dickens at the Daily News. 2-minute stroll away, at 5 Wellington Street South, not far from Punch, where Punch used to be, was the office of the Examiner, edited by Dickens's close friend and literary advisor John Forster. At 17 Upper Wellington Street lived briefly one of the most famous contributors to household words, G.A. Sala. And number 17 also previously had housed Douglas Jerrold's weekly magazine. These Wellington Street writers and editors wrote for multiple publications, collaborated again and again in different combinations, and helped each other through shared contacts and shared publishing ventures. Many of them wrote plays for the Lyceum Theatre on Wellington Street. It's the Lyceum at the bottom, looking much as it does today, where they've got the Lion King on at the moment. They visited local coffee rooms, they set up informal clubs in local taverns. So the picture I'm trying to create for you here is that London's publishing world, in the Strand area in general, and in Wellington Street in particular, was made up of interconnected social and business networks. And Horne was very much a part of this, as were all the members of the London Punch team. Horne's appointment to Household Words in 1850 as a staff writer brought him to the very heart of Dickens's network. Horne took part in the evening editorial staff meetings at the Household Words office and joined in the evening gatherings of Dickens's friends at the office and dinners at Dickens's house. He was also a member of Dickens's amateur dramatics troupe and performed before the Queen with John Forster, Mark Lemon, one of the Punchites, and G.H. Lewis. Horne knew Forster, Dickens's friend, in his own right in the 1830s, and first met William Howitt, fellow Household Words contributor and later fellow emigrant, through his mother. Horne went on to write for Howitt's journal and may even have lent money to establish it. Perhaps it was at the Howitt's house in Clapham that Horne first met Dickens. Either way, in 1846, Horne was taken on as Ireland correspondent for Dickens's Daily News, and so joined a distinguished list of contributors, including Punchites, Lemon, and Douglas Jerrold. Horne collaborated with Jerrold and Angus B. Reach on their Whittington Club and contributed to Douglas Jerrold's Shilling magazine. So when Horne arrived in Melbourne, he carried with him immense cultural capital. So what about Collins Street? Well, as I'm sure you all know, in 19th century Melbourne, Collins Street was the centre of the publishing trade. Physically, Collins Street was much more like Fleet Street or the Strand, a big artery, than Wellington Street. It was, and still is, I should imagine, although I haven't actually been there myself, longer, broader, and more fashionable than Wellington Street, and was home to such publishing heavyweights as the Argus, the Age, and the Melbourne Herald. But Horne and Punch reveal structural connections between the print culture of the two places. In 1855, the following notice was published in the Argus, one of the two main Melbourne daily papers, published at 76 Collins Street East. Melbourne Punch, Junior, Esquire, begs to announce that having emigrated to the city which bears his name, both he and the city were named in compliment to a late illustrious Whig nobleman, he was determined to issue a weekly periodical of a highly interesting and instructive character. The first number will appear on or before Thursday, the 2nd of August. As it would ill become the modesty of youth to vaunt untested excellence, Mr. Punch, Junior, contents himself with observing that his periodical will be in all respects superior to everything of the kind hitherto attempted in the universe. Printed and published, etc. By Edgar Ray at the Auction Mart Daily Advertiser Office, 66 Collins Street East, Melbourne. This sort of mimicked the reports published in Melbourne's newspapers, which marked the arrival of noteworthy emigrants. The first number of Melbourne Punch carried a cartoon of Mr. Punch Jr.'s triumphant arrival in Melbourne, as I noted at the beginning, as its founding editors worked to create a body for their personified periodical. It's quite small, but here, Melbourne Punch trades on itself as a transplanting of London print culture. So above the cartoon of Punch's arrival in Melbourne, here, is the depiction of his departure at the very top. We see Melbourne Punch as a member of the Punch family, and it says, son of the celebrated Mr. Punch of London. And note how the low-key family scene of departure at the top becomes like a grand state welcome at the bottom. The reader is asked to infer from this cartoon that Punch Jr. will go on to do great things in the colony, even as they're asked to enjoy its mockery of the expectations of gold rush emigrants. London print culture is being used to bolster Melbourne's fledgling papers and periodicals, even to the extent of the spoof reports from the Times and the Argus in the middle, that they're laid side by side, and so they're given equal status and weight. A review in the Argus of this first number noted that the title page represents Mr. Punch Jr. as seated in his chair of office. The well-known features of his sire may be traced in his physiognomy. The whole figure is significant of vigorous youth. This carries a dual meaning, as the well-known features of Mr. Punch could be both the resemblance of the cartoon son to his cartoon father, and the resemblance of the layout and typeface of Melbourne Punch to its London parent. The body of the emigrant and the materiality of the printed page are linked. The vigorous youth of this new venture is used to both link Melbourne Punch to and differentiate it from the London version. The notice in the Sydney Empire, which announced the arrival of Horne and his travel companion from Household Words, William Howitt, also played up their old world credentials, like the spoof report of the arrival of Melbourne Punch. It portrayed the two men as carriers of London print culture. The ship Kent, which arrived at Melbourne 2 or 3 weeks ago, brought to that colony two gentlemen who've earned for themselves a distinguished rank in the world of literature. We have not heard what are the ostensible objects of their voyage, but it may be fairly presumed that the gentlemen to whom we now particularly allude have in contemplation literary works on the social state and mineral developments of Australia. As it may be safely calculated that these gentlemen will shortly visit our metropolis, we have extracted from a work recently published in London the following brief notices of their literary antecedents. It's fortunate that the Empire was not aware of Horne's real motivation for emigration, which was simply to get rich quick by joining the gold rush. There's a strange tension in evidence in the Empire's notice between pride in the resources and energy of the youthful colony, and remember Melbourne was founded in 1835, and awed fetishization of the literary world of London and the old country. Horne's symbolic status as a literary celebrity in the Empire report comes not just from the work of his own pen, but from the fact of his perceived distinguished rank in the world of literature. And this sense of Horne's and Howitt's participation in a specific world was bolstered by Horne's very participation in those Wellington Street networks in the 1840s and 1850s. As this representative of the culture of the mother country, Horne's influence upon the younger literary arrivals to Melbourne was considerable. As the journalist Alexander Sutherland wrote, in Melbourne, Horne stirred up his young companions who formed a little clique to think of literature as an aim worth striving for, and in the midst of an utterly bohemian life, he had a reckless devotion to art that had an unmistakable influence. Horne thought of himself as a poet. His poem Orion, his epic Orion, is what made his name in London. It's pretty bad poetry. But I think people weren't celebrating him for what he was actually writing, but for the very image that he had. He would sit in the corner of books, Dwight's bookshop, and he had his hair in curls, he wore a cape, he was very flamboyant, and was creating an image, a particular image of literature as a worthy endeavour. This clique included such acclaimed writers as Marcus Clarke and George Gordon MacRae, and possibly also Henry Kendall and Adam Lindsay Gordon. After the publication in 1864 of Horne's lyric drama Prometheus, not a great read, but still, he became the literary celebrity of Melbourne. In Dwight's bookshop in Bourke Street, owned by Horne's colonial publisher, the young literary men of Melbourne gathered for hard drinking and boisterous practical jokes. Horne himself declared in his Australian autobiography that, "I had many invitations and received many kindnesses from persons to whom I had no other introduction than the knowledge of my literary position in the old country." It's rather a shame, actually, I think, that Horne was persisting in his sense of himself as a poet, when actually his prose writing and his Australian autobiography in particular, is very good. But Horne provided a physical link with the culture of home. A conversation with Horne was one remove away from a conversation with Dickens or with Gerald. So despite the facts of Horne and his network's physical separation from London then, they used print to create an embodied idea of cultural capital and a cultural construction of physical proximity. They drew material and structural links between the worlds of Collins Street and Wellington Street. Of course, the strangeness of Melbourne upon arrival and the hardships to be faced by the unwary middle-class emigrant were emphasised in much emigration literature, including accounts by Howitt and Horne. And there's a real emphasis on latent masculine aggression in the descriptions of the streets of mid-century Melbourne. And the sanctum of the editor's office was represented as not safe from this violence. In 1855, the editor and publisher of Melbourne Punch were attacked by the irate target of one of Punch's cartoons. This is the account. On Thursday afternoon, Mr. Burnell, formerly a gold commissioner, and who figured rather prominently in a caricature in that morning's Punch, called at Punch's headquarters in Collins Street, where he met the reputed editor, Mr. Frederick Sinnott, and the publisher, Mr. Edgar Ray. After some conversation of a not over-amicable character, assisted by Mr. Burnell proceeded to administer a dose of corporal chastisement, assisted by Mr. Candor. The result was that the Punchites got well punched, and as is generally the case with those who come off second best in such encounters, they have applied for and obtained summonses against their assailants. The double charge of assault will be heard in the City Court this morning, when Punch Jr. will have the honour of making a personal acquaintance with his very particular friend, the Right Worshipful, and a bench of magistrates. This report first appeared in the Melbourne Herald, and given that the Herald's office was on Collins Street as well, the staff there may well have heard the commotion at number 66. The magistrate ruled against Punch, which responded with this cartoon. You've got an image of the editor sitting at his desk, surrounded by weaponry and fierce dogs, and advertising for a pugilist who's going to defend him. So on hearing of these events, Horne could have been forgiven if he decided that life as an editor and writer in Collins Street was far removed from life at 16 Wellington Street North. However, responses to colonial life were of course far more complicated than that. London and Melbourne were frequently aligned in language and rhetoric, and by what Wallace Kersop calls the transplanting of skills and of ready access to key networks in London. Amongst Horne's circle, he was not the only emigrant with connections to Wellington Street. Horne sailed to Melbourne with William Howitt, as I said, and his two sons aboard the Kent. Howitt, his wife, and his daughter also wrote for Household Words. Godfrey Howitt, his brother, had a house at the east end of Collins Street, famous for its high-walled garden. Horne brought with him a letter of introduction to Captain Chisholm, who had an office nearby on Swanston Street. Captain Chisholm was the husband of Caroline Chisholm, whose household words article, Pictures of Life in Australia, had been edited by Horne. Caroline Chisholm became known as the emigrant's friend for her promotion of emigration schemes through her family colonisation society, and she is, of course, widely considered the model for Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House. It was the Chisholms who raised the subscription list for the colonial edition of Orion, a poem which made Horne's name in 1843, which was published by James J. Blundell, whose bookshop was at 44 Collins Street West. Horne's fellow contributors to Melbourne Punch had Wellington Street connections too. James Smith, editor and contributor between 1857 and 63, had once worked with Gerald, according to Horne's biographer Anne Blaney. Butler Cole Aspinall, another contributor, had been friends with J.H. Lewis in London, while James Stiff was the likely originator of one of London Punch's most popular jokes. Advice to those about to marry, don't. The unpaid contributor William A. Beckett, later Chief Justice, was the elder brother of Gilbert A. Beckett of London Punch. Gilbert was also in Dickens's acting troupe and had written for the Lyceum. In Melbourne, Horne came across Charles Gavin Duffy, also a contributor to Melbourne Punch, whom he'd first met in Ireland when he was Dublin correspondent for the Daily News. And Duffy edited the Nation weekly paper. Duffy got Horne a job during one of Horne's frequent penniless stays. All of these members of Melbourne print networks were emigrants rather than Australian-born. As well as biographical links to the print networks of Wellington Street, Horne and his fellow contributors to Melbourne Punch had a similar way of working to their Wellington Street counterparts. The brawl in the Melbourne Punch office proves Margaret Mahood's point that this was an urban community where everyone was more or less known to everyone else, at least in this particular world of publishing. What angered Sinnott's assailant was, according to the Argus report of the trial, that when he now went into the street, he was assailed by hundreds of ragged urchins with, "There goes the man in Punch." On passing an omnibus or carriage stand, the cry was, "There goes the man in Punch." And even when he entered any shop in town, there, staring him in the face, was the man in Punch. It was certainly very annoying to him. Just as amongst Dickens's network, business and socialising went hand in hand. Horne was a founding member of the Garrick Club, which never had enough money for a clubhouse, set up in direct imitation of the London version, along with Nicholas Chevalier, Archibald Mitchie, and James Smith, who'd all worked on Melbourne Punch. A similar group, but which included younger writers, went on later to form the Yorick Club in the 1860s, with its clubhouse in part of the Melbourne Punch building. According to Macrae's son, on the opening night, by 6 o'clock next morning, half the revellers were asleep, and George Wellstab, still sober, went the rounds blackening their faces in between the whiskers with burnt cork. At the Argus Hotel and Dining Rooms on Collins Street, near the Argus office, Smith and friends had a reserved round table where they met after the theatres closed. The Theatre Royal round the corner at 71 to 81 Bourke Street was the favourite haunt of Marcus Clarke and friends, immortalised in his sketch The Café Lutetia. As on Wellington Street, links of business, friendship and marriage became interwoven. The first editor and co-publisher of Melbourne Punch, Frederick Sinnott, was business partners with Archibald Mitchie, a friend of Horne's. Mitchie's daughter, Isabella, married the nephew of William A. Beckett. Melbourne Punch was surrounded on Collins Street by the Argus and its weekly The Australasian, the Age and its weekly The Leader, and the Herald. Of his fellow contributors to Melbourne Punch, James Smith, William A. Beckett, Charles Whitehead and Butler Cole Aspinall all wrote on other publications to which Horne also contributed work. Sinnott worked for both the Argus and Melbourne Punch. Theatre work kept them going too. Marcus Clarke started as a theatre critic for the Argus, was a prolific playwright, and he married an actress. Furthermore, famous London figures with Wellington Street connections were evoked and discussed through literary lectures, visits, and obituaries. The assumption was that the Melbourne reader not only knew who these people were, but cared. A construction of cultural proximity to London was also evident in the way the Melbourne periodical and newspaper press replicated London titles. As well as Melbourne Punch, Melbourne titles such as the Melbourne Illustrated News, the Australian Builder, the Spectator, the Melbourne Leader, and the Melbourne Examiner evoked, if they did not directly imitate, their London predecessors, of which the latter three, the Spectator, Leader, and Examiner, were all published from addresses on Wellington Street. More direct influences existed. The Victorian Review, the Melbourne Monthly Magazine, the Australian Journal, and the Australasian Monthly Review were all specifically modelled on London periodicals. In the names of Melbourne's main dailies, the Argus and the Age, we hear the echoes of Wellington Street. In the Post Office Directory for 1844, 13 Wellington Street North, 3 doors down from the building that would eventually house Household Words, where Horne worked, is listed as the office for the Argus weekly newspaper. By 1844, this paper had already merged with its rival, The Age, to form The Age and Argus. Punchite Shirley Brooks was the editor of this short-lived paper around the same time as he became first involved with the London Punch Circle. The culture of the mother country provided competition for the writers and editors of Collins Street, just as much as they used it as a reference point for their work. Imported books and periodicals from home in this period were big business in a colony with high literacy rates, as it cost at least twice as much to print a book in Australia as in England, and English publications also carried the charm and cachet of home. A Melbourne writer like Horne in the 1850s and 60s was much more likely to send their book to London for publication than to launch it locally, and in fact he sent his Australian autobiography to London. But this cultural tension energised Melbourne's print culture. Conditions changed over the 50s and 60s as men like James Smith and his contemporaries developed more of a local market for periodicals as well as books and newspapers. So, according to Lurline Stewart's figures, we get close to 200 literary or partly literary periodicals produced in Melbourne in the 19th century. And many of them starting in the 50s. The writers and editors of 1850s Melbourne then made clever use of this cultural double bind to develop Melbourne print culture. To compete with popular imported print, they needed to show what was distinct about their own work. Yet to assert the value of that work, they sought to show that they were linked to their London counterparts. They wanted to share the same virtual neighbourhood as Dickens and Gerald and Sala. They wanted to link Collins Street to Wellington Street. I'm going to finish with this cartoon here from Melbourne Punch, in which the youthfulness of Melbourne's up-and-coming commercial enterprises is emphasised through these figures of the street boys. But in the background, the sign Punch Junior reminds us that the new world has been born out of the old. And this cartoon, you've got 2 street boys. One is selling copies of Melbourne Punch, and the other is selling fruit and veg. And the one selling fruit and veg wants to trade dates for a copy of the periodical, but the boy selling the periodical is having none of it. He will only sell Melbourne Punch for cash. So in this cartoon, settler barter culture is shown as dying out. Melbourne Punch stands for capital and modern commerce, not just culture. The street boys embody the energetic and possibly unruly forces of young Australia. However, in using such a physical and material understanding of cultural capital, 1850s Melbourne print culture didn't want to escape old Europe. The body of the emigrant, whether in physical form or in periodical form, may have travelled the world, but the writers and journalists of colonial Melbourne still sought to maintain their links with the print culture of London. Ultimately, this embodied idea of cultural capital came with immense advantages for literary Melbourne. In the space of 2 decades, Melbourne went, as I said, from a small settlement to this lively literary hub. And of course, the goldfields, the money coming in, other factors would have had a crucial impact on this. But I think this transplanting of prefabricated brands like Punch and of emigrants like Horn played a significant role in this dramatic and exciting transformation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to our 2 speakers. I've got lots of questions myself. I don't want to hog the floor, however, but I'm very happy, on the other hand, to set the ball rolling too. So perhaps if I might do that with a question for Ken. It's actually a sort of 2-part question, really. 1 part clarificatory and 1 part not. The clarificatory part is about the native companion, and it reminded me of work on the Australian Natives Association that's been done by Marion Aveling and others. And the clarificatory point is the native companion is referring to white natives, I take it, or is it also encompassing Aborigines as well? I was interested in the title, essentially. That's the first one. And then the second question is about the cost base for producing some of these magazines and journals. And it struck me that we might perhaps regard them in a similar way to zines today, in that they're very ephemeral. Some of them come and go quite quickly. And I noticed that the point you said that Lothian was involved in many of them. So I'm wondering if you have any evidence of how much it costs to sort of produce one of these, and how many readers one needed to keep it afloat. And so, yes, I was just sort of interested in the kind of cost base of them.
Sure. So the native companion is a native bird species, which is the, what is it again? Yeah, exactly, the broadgoat. Which is, I mean, in terms of thinking about, the journal's relationship to Aboriginal people, actually there's very little interest in Aboriginal people in the native companion. And there's actually very little interest in native species. There's no interest in broadgoats either, and native birds. It's a kind of co-opted. I mean, I thought of this reading Donna Haraway's book on, that book she's written about dogs and, what was it called? I've forgotten. On Species or something like that. Which talks about, which wants to recuperate the dog. And there's a long passage where she contrasts the dog as a pet with the wolf and the kind of romantic notion of the wolf. And she talks about that word companion, right, which means to break bread together. Yeah, exactly. To sit down and share bread. At the table. So a dog is a companion species, and a wolf isn't a companion. You don't sit down and break bread, right? But so the native companion is a really interesting thing, because it's kind of like you're recuperating a native species into a kind of domestic framework. You don't need the native species. It's domesticated to a degree. So those images, the Ruby Lindsay painting, for example, which shows a small group of native companion birds of broadgoats communing with a writer or with a kind of muse figure or something like that is part of that. Actually, the journal has no interest in. That's not entirely true. There are a couple of stories. There's a story written from a horse's point of view, but it's kind of domestic species, really. Anyway, it hasn't got much interest in nativeness as a category. And then your second point is how much do these journals cost? And Stuart Sayers goes into this in some detail in his little book on Thomas Lothian. So with a native companion, Thomas Lothian thought that if he could sell 1,500 copies, he would begin to make money. But the print runs were always, never more than 1,500 copies, and he's supposed to have shifted 1,500 copies of the native companion in each issue. And I don't know about outlay in return, but that was supposed to have been enough to break even.
Mhm.
I think I'd said that the Heart of the Rose only had a print run of 500 copies, but it cost more to buy, and it only ever intended to come out as four copies, and maybe that also was a break-even enterprise. The only other thing I'd say is that the sales of a number of Australian journals are surprisingly high. I mean, the Lone Hand circulating at around 50,000 copies per issue, at least in terms of how that's recorded, at least in terms of the first 4 or 5 issues, is remarkable. I read somewhere that the Argus, for example, around that time, around 1907, was selling about 103,000, 104,000 copies. So a journal like the Lone Hand is selling about half the number of a daily newspaper, which is kind of phenomenal. I'd be curious to know how many issues Melbourne Punch sold or printed.
That's a good
Yeah.
question.
Good question.
I don't actually know the circulation of Melbourne Punch, or none off the top of my head. But I mean, certainly it was extremely successful in the long running. Unlike the first attempt of Sydney Punch, which folded after a year.
And there is this argument that Australia has a higher literacy rate than Britain in this period.
Sure.
And reference is always made to Cole's Book Arcade as allegedly the biggest bookshop in the world, and people flocking there and so on. So
It's
it is
very much
interesting
so.
that there's a market
Yeah.
for these, and people think it's worth the risk of setting one up for distribution. But let me turn to the floor. Sheridan's got a hand up first.
That was really fascinating, the papers, very, very interesting, and complement each other well. I just following on from that question, do you know much, I mean, not in terms of read numbers, but who exactly were reading these magazines, or do we know anything about the readers, or who they were aimed at?
I haven't looked into reception at all, really. Mary's paper was so interesting because it, amongst other things, reminds us of the breadth of sociality. You know what I mean? The sense that you had actually these quite elaborate networks involved in print culture, and colonial journalists were publishing, involved in contributing to and publishing newspapers, but they were also writing. I mean, James Smith's a very good example, also writing for the journals, and there's an awful lot of cross-fertilisation, and the groups are quite large and a bit promiscuous and porous too. People are joining and then leaving and kind of moving from Sydney to Melbourne and so on, and even if the readerships are only people attached to those networks, that's still a pretty considerable readership.
Well, that's what I was wondering, is it a group that's sustaining its 1,500 circulations?
Yeah.
Be a group that's sustaining each other.
Kind of a
So
self-sustaining
so-
group, you mean, yeah.
So the people that write one are buying the other.
I don't think that's always true, because if you think, I mean, the Bulletin had a massive bush and provincial circulation. And, I mean, the other really long-lasting journal in Australia is called the Australian Journal, which Marcus Clarke, and of course, and others, and George Wallstra were involved in. And it lasted for something like 90-odd years, I think, and the circulation of that journal would have been quite considerable. And it's quite interesting, because the journal it begins as a monthly and then seems to be doing so well that it becomes a weekly for a while. So it can afford to become a weekly. And then when it does less well, it becomes a monthly again, and then it becomes a weekly again. So its fortunes ebb and flow a bit, and that means its readerships would shrink and grow. But they must have been considerable enough for a journal like that to last so long.
I think with Melbourne Punch as well, in the early part of the period, in the 50s, what they were, their readership was very specific in that they were competing with Punch from London. It was being shipped in vast quantities, and the Illustrated London News as well. So it was very much a drive to capture that market with something that looked familiar but had a local flavour rather than jokes about London politicians. And you know, even the typeface and the line drawings are definitely trying to sort of capture that reader so that they've got something that looks familiar. Because that was the main problem, that people were reading London Punch and more familiar with that than the Melbourne version.
Yeah, they bought a lot of, English journals and periodicals were flowing into Australia and were heavily read too. And the other thing maybe to say is that magazines like the Australian Journal, which began, in 1865, something like that, lasted to about 1940, something or other. Anyway, were not high-minded. They were quite lowbrow and published and serialised a lot of English stuff. So, because you know that your Australian readers are connected to Britain, right? So you need to be able to serialise a lot of new English novels and stuff like that to keep those readerships alive, but alive in an Australian journal, so that they can read British serialised popular fiction in an Australian journal alongside Australian writers, and that became quite important to do. So you can expand your readership that way, so that if people are not that interested in local writing, they can still read your journal for serialised British fiction, that kind of thing.
Can I just push a bit further on that question of kind of audience and reception, because it made me think when you were talking about kind of how bad Horne's poetry is, that he is nevertheless kind of received as a great literary figure. Does that kind of suggest a lack of taste on the part of the Australian audience, or is it that they are?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or is it that they know full well that he's not that good at that, but that what counts is precisely what you've been talking about, is his connections, and that he's not so hot himself, but he knows Dickens.
Yeah, I suspect it is more the latter, because Horne himself very much played up on this as well, and in some sense, I suppose, moving to Melbourne allowed Horne to be what Dickens was in London. He could finally cast off the shadow of this younger and more successful friend of his and be the centre of a network and be looked up to by an adoring younger crowd, just like Dickens was enjoying back in London. But also, to be fair to the Australian readers, Horne's poem Orion made his name in London as well. So it was perhaps general bad taste rather than localised bad taste.
Did he just not stand the test of time?
Yes, I think to be...
Yeah. Well, the other thing to say, though, is that and I was thinking about this a little bit yesterday. I gave a talk at UCL yesterday, and there's a graduate student who's doing some work on poetry published in newspapers during the Boer War, right? And she said, I've read a lot of dreadful poetry. And then what you kind of realise is that, it's a different kind of sort of mode of publishing to what we have today. Newspapers published a lot of poetry, but a lot of ephemeral poetry, or poetry that, is just kind of tied to the moment, really. And so if you're looking at poetry published in newspapers and in journals and periodicals, you have to wade through a lot of stuff that's not much good. And the stuff that then gets collected, well, actually, even the stuff that gets collected isn't all that great sometimes, but those are venues for publishing that actually publish a lot of poetry. They have a massive kind of turnover of, kind of poetic, production. And it's not going to be that great, sure.
And in a way, the point is to look for the themes, isn't it? This is a project that John Hurst undertakes in The Sentimental Nation, where he looks at pre-Federation poetry and the kind of epic qualities of nationhood that he detects in that poetry and the religious references. And he also says that a lot of this is absolutely awful writing, but one on the one hand has to think, well, is that imposing our own standards, or on the other, was it generally regarded as such at the time?
Yeah, and a lot of... no,
Sorry,
no,
I was just going to say
sorry.
what's interesting about Horne's poetry, actually, to briefly speak up for it, is particularly Prometheus is a good example. He did exactly what you were pointing to, the idea of taking classical mythology from Europe and transplanting it into a supposedly empty Australian bush. And I mean, I do think it's a real shame that he very much felt that he was a poet and that was his calling, because his prose is so wonderful. I can really recommend his Australian autobiography. It's fascinating. But he was certainly part of that drive to link an Australian literature into an international scene. And I suppose, to be fair to him, that's what he was trying to do.
Now, Carl was the next cab in the rank, so over to you.
You talked about the body going out to Melbourne and the literature going out. What about the body in Melbourne going back to London? There's about a third of the gold rush immigrants who were middle class and went out on this period actually went back again.
And
So
Horne
that-
was one of those.
Yeah, so and did his work go back apart from the biography?
Yes. He wrote several articles for Household Words about they were fictionalised, but about his journey out to Australia and his experiences in the goldfields, which were very much heroic up his role as a gold commissioner. So those were published back in London in Household Words. And his Australian autobiography came out in London. I think it was published in Melbourne, but much later. So he was definitely keeping his hand
I
in.
wonder who the readership is then. He's writing for both ends.
Yeah.
And does he write differently when he's writing for each end?
That's a good question. I haven't actually asked myself that question.
I mean, maybe he doesn't.
Yeah, but
But perhaps he does.
But a lot of those people, I mean, William Howard and George Sala are two good examples, and there are many others, come out to Australia for 4 or 5 years or so. They don't stay that long.
yeah.
And they write a chronicle of their experiences in Australia. Thackeray did the same thing, and they write actually for a British readership. Really, they want to tell.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
If that's
that's
the
it.
case, if the two punches are sort of the same, but one's a local version of the other.
Well, it can be a
the
mix.
same guys are writing
Yeah,
both ends or trying to.
yeah, it can be a mixed blessing.
You end up with this little metropolis and the big metropolis,
Yeah.
multi, nodal network.
Absolutely.
And that makes it more interesting.
Absolutely, because Horne's Australian autobiography is very much about that. He talks about the telegraph and how it might link the two metropolises together, and how maybe we should move the seat of the British Empire from London to Melbourne because it's much nicer here and it's much sunnier and it's better. Everybody,
Or Cape Town or somewhere else. with something
Yeah.
else to do something.
but Melbourne would be better. And he's writing against emigration literature, which says it's really easy, emigrate, and your life will be golden. And it is very much for the London market, as trying to be a counter voice in this pro-immigration literature that's coming out in the 50s. So yes, he's definitely positioning himself, and I think Melbourne Punch is positioning itself as a node on a much bigger network that isn't national or even less just. Yeah, that it certainly isn't local, but it is very much. It is local, but it's also very global, and that's the point, that they are still very much part of the London network. They're not a separate offshoot. They're part of it. They just happen to be in Melbourne, but that's a side issue. Exactly. Yes.
That's an interesting point too, because those kinds of writers can often deliver some very bad news about Australia back to British readers and disenchant British readers about colonial Australia. I had looked a while ago at a guy called Robert Harrison, who came to live in Adelaide for about 4 years in the 1860s and then went back to Britain. And his book about Adelaide was published after he left Adelaide, and it was incredibly scathing. Adelaide is an unlivable place and so hot. He did this he kind of measured the weather. It was 100. He did that kind of colonial thing about it's 100 degrees in the shade. So measured the weather for about 4 years, really very carefully, and then concluded that Adelaide is an unlivable city, and this offended Adelaide readers. But by that time, the book had been published in Britain, right? So it was flowing back into the colony as a British published book. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
You're far too place.
I guess most of the question became that I'm wondering about the comments about drawing on sort of the continental European tradition, and particularly sort of classical mythology, and the way in which that's that's involved in a project of national self-definition against England, and how that's involved in sort of setting up a uniqueness about Australia. What struck me is how ununique that is in that, if you think about Yeats and the way that he drew on the same kind of French influences to define Ireland against Britain. I mean, I wonder what there is to say about the fact that this is a sort of project of constructing Australian uniqueness, but it's a pattern that is repeated in other, in other countries that have writers who have this sort of complexity and aestheticism that has a very French.
No, it's a really interesting thing to think about, I think, because we have such a strong conventional narrative about colonial Australia being essentially Anglophone and Anglophilic, is that right? Yeah, Anglophilic.
Anglo-prone, James Bellich calls it.
Anglo-prone, yeah, exactly. But I mean, putting aside actually a really intense interest in America too, right? And there is also, I mean, of course, there are a lot of Irish poets in Australia by this time. Bernard O'Dowd is one, who are developing a kind of Irish, kind of Franco-Irish mythology thing that's going on, and to do with Australia. But the interest in French literature, happens quite early on, really. It happens I mean, even the Bulletin is interested in French literature, and by the 1880s, 1890s, the Bulletin is publishing translations, of Rimbaud and Baudelaire and so on, and reviewing Oscar Wilde and kind of doing kind of Aubrey Beardsley and stuff like that too. So that kind of Anglo-continental thing is very interesting to the Bulletin. I mean, the Bulletin is not as I know John Docker makes this point, of course. The Bulletin is not as Anglo-Australian and Bush nationalist as we often tend to think. It's got a lot of it's interested in symbolism and decadence and stuff like that, and so it's interested in Oscar Wilde gets published in Australia very early on, surprisingly early on, really. And there's a lot of interest in kind of, British and European decadence, and of course in French symbolism. Yeah, absolutely.
Partly the answer to that is also because Australia has no geographical boundaries and is the entire world. Well, according to that quote that you wrote.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That is an
amazing.
Yeah.
Australia is everywhere. So therefore, everything will contain everything.
Yeah, I can see that quotation appearing on our website fairly soon.
It's a very good quote.
Yeah.
There is a little bit of a sense in that kind of radical. It's not a nationalism; it's a kind of radical Australian universalism, which says that all of these writers, and 2 or 3 times you'll see writers tracing genealogies that begin with Chaucer and end up in Melbourne. Right, the direct trajectory of literary influence ends up here, as if like Henry Lawson is the end point of some universal transhistorical theme. No, true.
Well, I guess that's interesting in itself, because sort of that teleology is very sort of Marxist in itself. Placing yourself at the end of the line as the hoped for enterprise, and Australia having this reputation as a social laboratory in this period. It would all fit together, wouldn't it? But Ellen's got a query next.
I do. I have a question for Ken. I hope this isn't too unwieldy. But anyway, so I was interested in your reading of Native Companion as kind of early modernism in Australia. And I suppose I wanted to ask about how you think about sort of how and why we decide to classify something as modernist. And I was thinking about this because, in modernist studies at the moment, there's this kind of real desire to find more and more modernism, to find that modernism in all kinds of places, and find modernism in the 19th century,
True.
and so on.
And proto-modernisms and so on.
Yeah, right. And so one thing I wondered when you were talking about Native Companion, which you see as sort of early modernism, is whether it ever sort of actually describes itself as modernist or as affiliated with modernity or the new or innovation or any of those kinds of tropes that we tend to associate with modernism. And if it doesn't, then does that matter? And on what are the terms by which you see it as kind of modernist?
Well, that opens up a lot of interesting issues. I mean, it's metropolitan. So when it talks about the bush, it talks about the bush as a remote category or a redundant category. And the vignettes are really interesting because they're very much about the kind of intense, representing in an intense way a consciousness.
Like subjectivity.
Yeah, so subjectivity becomes really important, and it's a metropolitan subjectivity,
Right,
and it's cosmopolitan, right? It's not nationalist. So I suppose those things and many others, and all the kind of European citational stuff. Really, I would say it's. I know what you mean. The qualifying of early modernisms is very annoying, right? But I would say that this is a kind of this is a nascent Australian modernism, and that's why Catherine, to publish Catherine Mansfield is very interesting because she comes to the Native Companion as she's published, she's only 17, right? And she writes to E.J. Brady, and E.J. Brady doesn't believe that she's 17. Actually, he doesn't believe that she's a woman either. And then says, okay, I'll publish, send me your stories. And then he kind of says, okay, these are women's stories. And actually, he makes a point of investing in women writers who work in that kind of way, who produce these really short, these short vignettes that are really intense and kind of erotic, really, and kind of about yearning and desire and so on, and longing to be somewhere else and stuff like that. And none of them invest in any sense of a nation or nationhood or anything like that. And he wants to gather together around him a group of young women writers who are able to do that kind of work, and they're all metropolitan, even though Mansfield at that time wasn't. But she'd been to London and then back again, I think, by that time. So she's already had that metropolitan experience. So she's shaped already. I had thought, actually, reading some of Mansfield's stuff in the New Age, in that, later on, those stories are very long and turgid, and the stories in the Native Companion are really short and really good, and it's like she got worse before she got better again after that. But I think that you can make a case that there is a shaping, and if you think of the illustrations and the cover designs, the work of Ruby Lindsay and Blammy Young, which I wanted to show, is that there is an interest in kind of flow and subjectivity and form and a whole load of things that, and kind of a metropolitan feminine thing and in the muse and so on that you never got before.
Right,
Also classic art,
yeah, sure, yeah, but it's reconfigured. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Can I just pick up on that and ask about the juxtaposition of art and text in some of the images that you showed? But it's a question that also applies to Punch, of course. The question kind of comes from a comment that's in Norman Lindsay's autobiography, My Mask. And he says that often he didn't really know what he was doing when he was drawing because he was commissioned by one publication, then he had to run across town and draw another one, and then he had to go somewhere else and finish one more still. And a lot of the people that you're discussing worked in multiple capacities on different publications. So I'm wondering, as a researcher, how you then might read the images that go along with the text, given that you're not always sure of the way that they were produced.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose, one of the most interesting things I think is about punk culture in this time in any city is that interconnectedness and the way people were working on multiple periodicals for aesthetic reasons, but also for economic reasons, for the sheer ability to survive and eat. And I suppose, yes, one does always have to think of the conversation between text and image not just as a conversation that is happening within a periodical or on one particular page, but perhaps a conversation that's happening across publications. So that those Punch cartoons are also speaking to London Punch cartoons, or maybe a cartoon in Johannesburg Punch, or to another publication that's a few doors down because somebody just happened to have a chat in the street about a similar issue. And these are links that we can't necessarily ever know because so much of the record is lost, and so many memoirs don't actually give us those kind of specifics, which would be helpful to know. So yes, I certainly think that conversation between text and image is something that's happening across periodicals and also across national boundaries, rather than just on that bordered page.
Well, I mean, the really striking thing people would have noticed is that the Native Companion looks incredibly different to Punch, right? And it looks different because the Native Companion invests in art, and the Punch invests in caricature and cartoon. And what's interesting about the Bulletin of course also invests in caricature and cartoon, and and some of the artists who sketched for the Native Companion and drew and painted the cover designs were also cartoonists who could do caricature, and you had a crossover between, Norman Lindsay's a very good example. So Norman Lindsay could do grotesque cartoons on the one hand and these kind of classically influenced paintings on the other, there is that crossover, and that link between art and text is, someone was talking to me about this around the end of last year when we were talking about this, and actually, Mary, your paper was very interesting in many respects. One of which was that when you showed the cartoon and the commentary on someone who walked into the Punch office and punched the editor, of course, one could not help but think about the Paris events from not long ago, the Charlie Hebdo events. And of course, you're reminded that, in Australia, much as anywhere else, I would imagine, and this is kind of the logic of, the cultural logic of Punch, there is a kind of light satirical mode that is about caricature, but there's also a vicious satirical mode as well, which can be much more in your face and confrontational and offensive. And one could very well walk into a cartoonist's office however, by contrast, the Native Companion, which was never offensive visually, and never ran caricatures or cartoons of any nature at all, let alone offensive cartoons, was entirely free. The editor was never harassed or beaten up. True.
That Bernard guy goes in there with his thug, presumably, bashes up the editor and the beaks him off.
Yeah.
Because he's a Goldfields commissioner and he knows them.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
Pretty,
Well, that's the
pretty
other
random sort of world.
Yes, in such a small.
And then the next day they publish another cartoon.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's interesting too, because it shows you that, one would say, je ne suis pas Punch, you know what I mean? It's like I'm not, the sense of social feeling is not necessarily with Punch.
You can keep,
Yeah.
you can keep publishing, but you still have to keep fighting.
Sure, yeah.
Or ducking.
It'd be interesting to know why, when he's being recognised everywhere, that's the Punch man, that's the Punch man. Is he famous because of the original Punch caricature, or because of the court case that followed?
Yes, I think, I'm trying to think about the dates of when that one. I think it's both, because that account comes after the trial. So it's clearly, the trial was publicised as well, and Punch keep running cartoons about how annoying, isn't it? Yes, fabulous publicity.
It is good, very good.
It's wonderful, and also this sense of, I'm still sitting here at my desk with my
no, he's not
bulldogs
dead.
under the table.
That's right.
Yeah, they're still laughing at this guy who's taken things so very seriously.
But there were a few, again, short-lived satirical journals. Marcus Clarke published a journal called Humbug, and
Another one called Quiz.
Yeah, and a journal called Ha Ha, which I quite like. But I've forgotten who the editor was anyway. But you know, part of that network and so on. And they are actually they can be a bit vicious too. Actually, they can be. Yeah, in terms of caricature, you know. Yeah.
Clark's another interesting one because of he's so busy in the Australian nation, sorry, linking Melbourne with London, isn't he? But also
Yeah.
linking Melbourne with Paris. Back to your point about writing against a European scene that isn't just London.
Yeah, because he was a big reader of Balzac as well as Dickens,
and
so
Hugo,
so,
of course.
yeah, and Hugo too.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he's trying
And
to
imports
Hugo
those things in,
plus
yeah.
Dickens,
Yeah.
Any further questions from the floor? Amanda, maybe?
What's so rubbish about Thomas Lothian? What else did he publish?
Well, he was
Because the name is sort of ringing a bell with me.
Yeah, well, he was. Sometimes he's confused with his father, who was ended up as a very rich, you know, publisher, publishing a lot of stuff, and so Thomas Lothian is a smaller scale publisher. Publishes a lot of Australian poetry. In that first decade of the 20th century, about like 24 volumes of poetry. And these journals, and then, you know, like a lot of colonial publishers, then kind of gives it away and and goes into the broader business of book selling and book distribution and so on. So this is really, this first decade of the 20th century for Thomas Lothian is really a kind of a short-lived but really intense investment in a particular kind of Australian literature, and so Stuart Sayers' book on Thomas Lothian, on the Lothians really, and of which Thomas Lothian is just a chapter towards the end, is kind of quite good because you get a sense of this massive publishing enterprise, then kind of, you know, producing at the end this guy who invests in this really peculiar little kind of field of writing, that, you know, very Europeanized, francophone, you know, francophilic poetry, and these weird journals, you know, and then moves on.
Because he can afford to.
Yeah, because he can afford to. Yeah, that's why the breaking even issue is not a big deal for him. Yeah.
Okay, well, before we thank our speakers, let me just announce a couple of events to pop in your diary. We've heard from Ken's wonderful quote that Australia is everywhere. Well, in the next event, one might have to look a bit harder than normal because it's titled The Arab Spring and Diaspora Fiction, and that's in collaboration with the KCL Post-Colonial Research Network. I am told there are some references to Australia in the paper, but anyway, that one is on the 28th of January at 6:30 back in this room. And then we have a book launch to look forward to on the 4th of February with a multiple edited book called In Turn, Ego Histoire, Europe and Indigenous Australia. And that publication features writing by one of our own again, MCAS's Helen Idle, so something to look forward to there as well. But before we conclude proceedings, let's thank our two speakers again.